started and now it started again. Here we go. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Who are we? So Conservation Watch, we're a group of concerned residents, and we're responding to the provincial changes that happened in kind of late 2020, early 2021. I'm sure folks kind of remember the headlines: province attacking conservation authorities, province kind of taking over control of conservation authorities. So that's when we really said, oh my goodness, we as citizens, we need to be watching what's going on. And since then, we've been attending 5 local conservation authority meetings every time they have their board meeting. And so they've been reporting on how these changes have been impacting them. But through watching this process and through learning more about how our local natural areas are protected, we've also been able to hear about what development proposals are coming forward in our community. And so it's because we've been able to monitor the Hamilton Conservation Authority, the Halton Conservation Authority, the Grand River Conservation Authority. We're trying to get into the Credit Valley Conservation Authority, as well as we've been at the Niagara Conservation Authority. So these are all kind of in the Hamilton area. And we're working with environmental groups across the province to expand that coverage. And it's because folks are watching these conservation authorities that we can kind of see these proposals and get ahead of the developers who are really trying to change our community for the worse. So before we start, this may be common knowledge to some, but I think it is really important that we can kind of all come to the same understanding here at the beginning. What is a wetland? And really it's wet land. It's land that is seasonally or permanently covered in shallow water. So think of bogs, swamps, marshes, and that's really what this wetland in question is it's a marsh. And why wetlands are important is not only can they store water, which kind of refills our groundwater, but they protect us. And again, I'm calling in from Dundas, so they protect us from the worst impacts of floods. I live in a valley. That sounds great to me. They can stabilize shorelines, control erosion. They purify water by filtering out nutrients, sediments, and pollutants. Particularly cattails play a really big role in that. And we're going to get to the site visit we did, and I think we'll see some cattails there. And wetlands also provide essential habitats, including an estimated 20% of Ontario's species at risk. So wetlands are so essential, but they're at risk across the province. So the world is estimated to have lost at least 64% of its original wetland area. So that's almost 2/3 of all original wetlands in the world are just gone. And Ontario holds 6% of those remaining wetlands and 25% of Canada's total. So this is such an important place to be having this conversation. In Southern Ontario, we've lost nearly 3/4 of our original wetland coverage. So that's higher than the world average. And it's because of this that wetlands are still at risk and still being destroyed today. So it's really, really essential that we're kind of getting involved as a community. We are on the front lines here in Southern Ontario of ensuring globally that wetlands are protected. So just kind of jumping back a bit as to like, why are these wetlands at risk and kind of what's been going on. So we've been talking, because this isn't the first wetland that's been talked about being paved over in Ontario. So a couple of months ago, we got connected with the folks in Pickering and Ajax who were talking about the Duffins Creek wetland being paved over for what then was discovered to be an Amazon warehouse. And the province was ramming forward this decision at that time against the Conservation Authority's wishes. So we spoke to Conservation Authority staff on that issue, and here's what they had to say.
Give me a quick verbal sketch of the importance of Duffins Creek and associated wetlands.
It's a good question, Jim. So wetlands lead critical roles in ecosystem services. They provide flood mitigation, groundwater recharge and discharge, erosion reduction, climate change mitigation, biodiversity, habitat, nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration, and they're also very important for cultural and spiritual activities, medicinal and food sources, and recreation and tourism. What is really important to recognize is the sort of cumulative benefits of wetlands across the landscape. Duffins Creek wetland complex is one of the larger ones near the coast, and it provides that connectivity between the lake and the Oak Ridges moraine as sort of a stopover point for migratory species. And they're all wetlands, whether they're provincially significant or not, are important, and the provincial designation and the municipal official plan protections are needed to protect what is left. There are federal studies that recommend approximately 10% wetland cover and 30% forest cover are needed in urbanizing areas to mitigate erosion and flooding. And in TRCA's jurisdiction, we only have 15% forest cover and 1% of wetlands remaining. And so it's very important that we protect what we have and enhance them as well.
But we also spoke to someone a little bit more local. We spoke to Scott Peck from the Hamilton Conservation Authority about wetlands and wetland offsetting. And so here's a quick clip of our interview with Scott.
Could you summarize the main benefits of building or enhancing wetlands, just briefly?
Well, I think really the two main benefits of protecting wetlands and enhancing wetlands is really they are nature's filter. They are nature's storm water control, and they're also nature's, they're from a natural habitat perspective. And again, it depends on what type of wetland that you're talking about, whether it's a swamp or a marsh or a bog or a fen. They all have different habitats and different types of, I'll say, critters that keep there. But to me, keeping wetlands and enhancing wetlands it provides those storage from runoff events, be it storm events or winter runoff. It's water quality benefits. There's a lot of times wetlands can be associated with groundwater recharge areas that address that sort of interaction. There's always the natural heritage benefits, and I think from my perspective, it's the human perspective too, of being able to see just different types of habitat. I mean, when I was a kid, and being in Cubs and Scouts, we always went out and planted trees. And I always kind of fall back on that. As soon as I think of trying to restore an area, a lot of times I think we'll just plant trees. But, our ecologists are tremendous at the authority. They always kind of say, well, we could do prairie, we could do, a variety of different things. It's not just planting trees. So again, this is just a really good opportunity to highlight the benefits of maintaining them, but recreating them and creating those flooding, erosion, natural heritage, and human benefits of the wetlands.
So it's great to be building new wetlands, but the question here with this proposal is not necessarily just building new, but it's about replacing an existing wetland with a new kind of man-made artificial one. And I think that's really something to get at, is because the Ancaster Creek wetland is one of the only two remaining wetlands in the Ancaster Creek watershed. And it's the last one that's located in its original place. Like, wild. When you think about that, we think, I walk Spencer Creek. It feels like there's something that's been here forever. Kind of the community is built up around that. But that's not necessarily true as we kind of go. We've had a huge impact as we've as a people settled this area and kind of kept bringing in more and more area into the urban area. We've changed where the water goes, and oftentimes to the detriment of ecosystem health. And so, for example, another thing that makes this wetland and this kind of the Ancaster Creek that flows from it so unique is that it's a cold water creek. And cold water creeks provide a unique habitat for so many important species. I believe salmon, Chinook salmon, are one of them. And again, I'm coming from the perspective of Dundas, but they are coming right up into Dundas. And it's because we have that cold water flowing into the stream that helps make that a hospitable habitat, is my understanding. And so, as we kind of heard from Scott Peck, wetlands are important, and they've specifically described this Ancaster Creek wetland as locally significant, and have recommended to the Conservation Authority Board not to support its removal, its paving over, regardless of if the developer says we're going to replace it. So yeah, kind of moving ahead and understanding what's actually being talked about here. We have wetlands and we have warehouses. And what we really need to do is we need to get the Conservation Authority Board to listen to their own staff. Their own policy says they do not support the removal of an existing locally significant wetland. And so this is really should be a clear-cut issue. And we're hoping that the Conservation Authority Board sees it as such. So here's kind of an aerial view, and we're out where I begin to stop talking and Dawn will begin to start. But here you can see the Ancaster Creek wetland that we're talking about. Here's Garner Road East, here's Highway 6 South, and here's the proposed plan for the site. So what we're gonna get in, and we did a site visit because we really wanted to get in deeper. These are the photos that the proponent, the developer, provided to the Conservation Authority. We wanted to take some of our own and kind of fact check some of the stuff in the report. So Dawn, do you want to take it away and tell us a little bit about what kind of came up on that site visit or anything I've missed up until this point?
Thanks very much, Alex. And it was I had the opportunity to visit there last night. I've got Nancy Hurst was one of the people with me, and Nancy was the arranger of this. There was some media there, and others that came along with us to have a look at the area that the developers are basically saying is, first of all, they said that there's really no bulrushes there, that it's all been taken over by an invasive species called Phragmites. The Phragmites is actually only a very small portion of this, less than 20%. And it's a big area. When you can look at a map and you say, oh, that's there's a map there and there's something there that's called a wetland. But when you actually get into it, we spent quite a long time walking around this wetland and having a look at it. And it's beside agricultural fields. So one of the things that's also affected by this proposal is the elimination of a lot of agricultural fields. Local food sources growing a number of things, including pumpkins. And the farmer that has their home at the entrance to this area on Garner Road doesn't own the land, but rents some of the land and farms some of the land, and is known as Ancaster's Pumpkin Patch. And I gather, certainly from Ancaster residents, that that's a really important cultural thing for the people of Ancaster to know that they can go down there and get their pumpkins. If this project goes ahead as it's being proposed, that won't happen anymore. Those lands will be part of the warehouse and paving parking lots that are involved here. So you've talked a little bit about, Alex, what the project is being presented as. I should start by saying that whatever the project is being presented as, it may not be. This is not for the Conservation Authority to determine how many warehouses or where to put parking lots or anything like that. The Conservation Authority is being asked to give a permit to move this wetland, or basically to pave over this wetland and dig a hole along Highway 6 and call that a new wetland. So I've got more photos there we can flip by, and I think we've got some video that we can play as well. And yeah, some of the plants that we were looking at as we went around there. A little more. I'm not a plant botanist, so there's some milkweed coming up. Jim Quinn was one of the people who, Dr. Quinn from McMaster Biology, and he helpfully explained that there were 3 different types of bulrushes. The one in his right hand, furthest to the left side of the photograph, is the native species, and then the other 2, one is a European species that has also become widespread not only here but in Coots Paradise, and the one in between is a hybrid of the 2. And I think there was some video taken to pick up some of the bird, and there were lots of birds there.
That might have been a little bit quiet, but Nancy, you were on site. Do you wanna tell us about some of the sounds that you were hearing as well?
Yes, for sure. I've been there 3 times now because I was just curious to meet the people that have the pumpkin patch, knowing that their entire property was going to be surrounded by warehouse development. So I just pulled into their driveway one day knowing that, I live close by. So, and I was delighted to find out that they have actually, their name is Book from Book Road. They've been farming this land forever. So they don't own the land now, but they do lease it back, and they're intimately familiar with the land and the wetland. So I've been there a few times now and seen all kinds of different things, coyote tracks and tons of bird life. I only live 5 minutes away, but there were birds there that I'd never seen. Certainly a lot of life in that wetland. There is so much going on there. It's a joy to be in there. It's just beautiful. There isn't a pond, but it is all spongy and wet and soggy. And the farmers tell me that when they dig a hole or dig ditches, it fills up with water right away. By the end of the day, it's full of water. It's just a huge, big sponge, the entire area. I've seen the trilliums in the forest. What's been described to me are the hundreds of swans that land in this field here as they are migrating through. They'll stop and rest because in the spring, this is full of water, this whole area. So they stop and rest and continue on their way. Full of life, all kinds of things going on there. And this is the headwaters of the Ancaster Creek headwaters. So this particular area here, if it's removed, it's going to remove a significant portion of the headwaters of this creek, which will of course affect every part of the creek that flows all the way through Ancaster and eventually over the escarpment and into Coots. And if this is surrounded by concrete on 4 sides, it's even if they dig a hole and fill it with water, there's no way it's going to be a wetland. It's going to be a retaining pond. Another interesting thing that happened is a resident whose name I see on here today reached out to me to tell me that in 2013 he encountered a Blandings turtle, which is either a species at risk or possibly endangered. I'm not sure. But he was possibly was crossing the Garner and crossing across from this property to get to the north side of the road, possibly to do some nesting. So that wasn't reported until just now. So hopefully that poor little lady is still alive and still nesting in that area somewhere. And I just want to say that this area here is just one of many, many, many wetlands all across the entire mountain. The airport is the highest point on the mountain, and all the water flows down over the escarpment from there. So it's the headwaters of all of our creeks here in Hamilton. So anything that we do to save this wetland here will hopefully set a precedent, because I personally know of 3 other applications that are coming down the line just from looking at the city's applications map. I know that there are at least 2 or 3 other applications coming down, and many more to come. And when this land was rezoned as airport land, I don't know, back in 2015, they always say the same thing is, oh, it's going to be 15 years till it all happens. Well, those 15 years have passed, and now it's happening. It's happening all over the mountain. So we really have to push back against development on our farmland, our wetlands, and our habitat, or else we'll just have concrete all over the whole mountain, all around the airport and all the way down to Elfrida. I did put something in the chat if anybody wants to do a quick copy paste of all the counselors that I can find, whose emails I know, and a couple of the other board members. I'll put it in again, but if you want to do a quick copy paste into your CC box and email them all your letter, that's a really quick way to do it. It's just one click and you've got all their emails in there. Yeah, and I'm from Stop Sprawl, so please join us. I'll put the message in there too.
Yeah, I was actually just about to say thank you for that, Nancy. We're going to get to some take action pieces later, but Nancy's been so engaged in our community on the issue of sprawl and so many environmental issues, and it would be a missed opportunity not to remind everyone that in early June, you will be getting a survey about the urban boundary expansion. And it's so important to say, no, we do not want to expand our urban boundary, but you don't have to wait till early June. Right now, if you search Grids 2 on the Hamilton website, or maybe Nancy will be even so kind to put a link in the chat, you can fill out until Monday, the 31st. There's an opportunity on the Engage Hamilton website to also say no to growing and creating future of these issues. This is also the decision point for 15 years down the road, kind of again. So we can kind of say no now, and we can also say no in the future. Dawn, I might throw it back to you if that's okay.
For sure. Nancy mentioned the presence of this wetland and its location on the airport lands or close to the airport, and that the airport is the highest point of land, not only in Hamilton, but the highest point between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. So this is the headwaters, not only for Ancaster Creek, but also for the Welland River, for 20 Mile Creek. It is the point from which the water flows down, which is normal for a big hill. And it makes it very significant in terms of the source of waters that flow through our community and keeping those waters clean. And one of the exciting things that's happened in the last month, early in May, the provincial opposition environment critic, Environment and Conservation, Sandy Shaw, wrote a letter in opposition to what is being done to this creek and wetland, and calling on the provincial government to take action on this. So we have Sandy here with us tonight, and that's great. She's also the MLA or MPP for this particular location. So this is in her bailiwick. Thanks for being here, Sandy. And I think we can probably pull you in here if more than just a photograph at this point.
Yeah.
Good.
Thanks very much. I want to say also thank you for the presentation. I learned a lot. I did learn a lot. That I didn't know it was the highest point, the tundra swans. It's just heartbreaking to think about them returning, and their nesting grounds have been paved over. It's awful. So I am the opposition critic for the environment, and really what I want to say is it's so heartwarming to see so many folks on the line today, because you would like to think that your government is there to protect the environment and protect our natural heritage. It's not the case. And I'm sure that you'd like to think that there are environmental protections in place if the government's not so amenable, that the environmental protections are a backstop, but those are being really dismantled by this government. And so really the last line of defense is your opposition and you folks, like community groups. This is the last line of defense. And having said that, though, there's been so many examples of success. So Duffins Creek was an example of a success where this government blinked on their horrible plan to pave over a wetland. I know also another example was a Shinyi glass plant in Stratford. People were opposed to that, and community groups organized and spoke up against this. And we had people, who came to like depute, so they come to committees of government to talk about what they've done. And I just want to say, like, these are just people that never in a million years expected that they'd be on the front line being what they would call like activists. Like when I said the word activist, they went, "Oh, we're not activists. We just want to save the wetland," right? So people are outraged by this from all walks of life, and it's this government's complete assault on the environment has created a groundswell of people that are just saying, like, hell no. You know what I mean? This is not what's happening here. And so, I guess without ragging on the government too much, I mean, it's quite obvious that they have a pro-development agenda at all costs. And sometimes people ask me, like, why does this government hate the environment so much? And I have to say, I'm not even convinced that they hate the environment so much. They just don't care about it. And in fact, the environment just happens to be in the way of their goal, which is to provide as much opportunity, as many financial rewards to their friends and donors as possible. So, I won't talk too long about this, but I want to say that it's true that there's been fights all across the province. In my role, we've been, trying to support groups, but this is like in our riding, and it's so infuriating. It makes absolutely no sense. I think I read, was it you, Nancy, when I read the article, it's the proponent said, we're just going to slide over the wetland. Like, what kind of thinking is this? Is going to slide over the wetland? And so
that was Councillor Ferguson who said that.
Yeah. So hello. So this is what we're up against, right? This is what you're up against. So yeah, we've seen a government that has, dismantled environmental protections. They've taken away the power of the Conservation Authority. I mean, they had to. The Toronto Region Conservation Authority was compelled to issue a permit for Duffin's Duffin's Creek, and the most remarkable thing is that the Conservation Authority directors had to say, we're doing this, under duress, which is a legal term saying that we wouldn't have done this normally, but we were forced to do it. So this government has gotten rid of conservation authorities, which was to protect the land. They've gotten rid of through the MZOs. They can override any planning protections. I think it was mentioned. Someone mentioned earlier that what we should expect, which would be planning designations, would be also something that should protect our lands. They're prepared to issue MZOs, which just blows that out of the water. And even recently we saw a bill, maybe I'm getting the weeds too much. I said water and weeds, we're talking about wetlands, but not only are they issuing MZOs, minister's zoning orders, which override environmental protections, they were given the advice from their own lawyers that this in fact what they had done was illegal, what they had done. So they passed a bill or put a provision in a bill that not only made going forward it legal to issue MZOs and override planning designations, but they actually did it retroactively. So that stuff that we did before when it was legal, we retroactively made it legal. So they are prepared to do anything to get what they want. And I mean, the list is long. I'm sure I've forgotten, some of them because the list is long, but we see the 413 is a highway that no one wants except developers that own land along that corridor that stand to benefit hugely when that highway goes through, which goes through parts of the Greenbelt and agricultural land. We've also seen a government that really is quite prepared to bend the rules in any possible way to benefit their developers. So I've lost my train of thought, but what I want to say is we're up against a juggernaut of a government that has a year left in their mandate and really wants to be able to deliver to political donors. And the connection between the MZOs, the Ministerial Zoning Orders, and developers, like they're just there, like it's just a matter of fact. It's not even, I don't even have to be a conspiracy theorist to say this is who got the MZO and this is who's donating to this party. They've got a lot at stake. And finally, the other thing about this movement pushing back or to protect our natural heritage is that there's a cross section of people that are standing up and speaking out on this. And I would also say the Ontario Federation of Agriculture has issued what was a remarkable rebuttal to what this government is doing, because they also understand the importance of wetlands in terms of protecting agricultural land and carbon sequestration. So I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, but I want to tell you that we're there in the House every single day. I'm up doing this every single day. To what end, I don't know, but it really is heartwarming to know that what we do in our role in the House legislatively is also a really nice pairing up with what community members are doing. So I want to thank you for this and thank you for your work, and assure you that I will do everything in my power to stop this, to speak out against it. We have the New Democrats have our Green New Deal we've put out. It's called Climate, Jobs, and Justice, and we will restore wetlands that have been destroyed under this government. We'll restore the power of the conservation authorities. It's in our policy platform, and it is also a very personal mission of mine, I guess I would say. Oh, I know what I forgot when I was rambling. The urban boundary expansion. So you've already mentioned that, but that's another tool in this government's plans to make sure that all of our lands are handed over with a nice tidy bow to developers. So that's it. I'm done. But thank you very much for having me, and anytime. And thank you so much for the work. And I think we're going to be successful in this. I can feel it in my bones.
Thanks so much, Sandy. Great to have you participating on this, and great to have the letter that you sent and your continuing efforts to make this more widely known and to oppose what is potentially a really disastrous move by the Conservation Authority in Hamilton. When we come to June 3rd and the meeting that is coming up, that the Conservation Authority Board is being asked to approve this wetland relocation or sliding over, or however you want to refer to it, their reputation is on the line in that meeting. That isn't the job of the Conservation Authorities. The Conservation Authorities have been well established and understood as bodies that actually protect the natural environment, the bodies that act to reduce the threat of flooding, to manage watersheds in a way that is healthy. We will be following this very closely on June 3rd. I know several people have asked to delegate there, and we will be, as part of our efforts, letting everyone know tonight how they can watch that meeting and see what takes place there. It's great to have a provincial representative, environment critic there helping us out. Thanks so much, Sandy.
Speaking of taking action and coming to the June 3rd meeting, we have some homework for all, no, homework's the wrong word, this is fun. We have some follow-up for all of you, because I think we've come out tonight, there have been 80+ people on this call, like really, really incredible for grassroots stuff. We're just getting started. So we have just four simple things that you can do to have your voice heard in the next week before June 3rd. So the first of these, and Steph's going to help me out by providing some of this info in the chat for you, but the first of these things is just to add your name, to put your name forward and say, no, I do not support this, because we really need some media coverage. We really want to kind of ramp up the heat in this next little week. So one of the things that's a tool in that is just having it saying, no, this is something that's not popular with the community. So we've created a petition, and you can add your name right there, and you can help save our stream. What you're signing in that petition happens to be these next three things that you can do. And it's asking these three decision makers to kind of step forward. So the first thing probably makes sense to a lot of folks. 60+ people have already done this in the lead up to the last meeting. And we're asking those folks to just resend those letters. And if you haven't sent a letter, to please consider sending one. Write to the Hamilton Conservation Authority and tell them to listen to their own staff and concerned citizens like all of us. Reject this proposal to offset, destroy, pave, slide over this locally significant wetland. And I think we've talked a lot, and we've really dived into the significance that you won't find in the proponent's kind of environmental overview of this site. So in the chat, we're throwing you the email, but the convenient thing is if you go back and you sign that petition, you get all of this contact information sent to you. And we'll also be sending it out to anyone who we have their email from registering for this webinar as well. So writing to the Conservation Authority and telling them, just please do not accept this proposal, and we can help you out with some rationale, but hopefully this webinar has given you some reasons as to why this is a bad idea. The next two things you can do are keep this up with Hamilton City Council. And Nancy, I think you put this so well, that this is just the start of a much larger series of developments that we're going to see, threats to our local watershed. So it's really important that we can get the entirety of our city council involved, not just the city councilors that happen to also sit on the Conservation Authority Board, which lacks maybe some of our more friendly or environmental city councilors, but getting the whole of city council involved in this and asking them to take some action. It's within their power to correct the mistakes of the past and rezone this wetland, not the whole property, but just this wetland, as conservation zoning under the City of Hamilton zoning bylaw. So we can make sure that this locally significant wetland basically comes off the market. And that's something we really need to do. Because if it's not this developer, what about the next one? And lastly, we can take this campaign province-wide. We are asking everyone to email Tyler Schultz. So he's the Acting Assistant Auditor General for the Commissioner of the Environment. So as Sandy mentioned, we used to have a Commissioner of the Environment in Ontario, but this provincial government acts that position. And now they kind of have less authority and are housed under the Auditor General. In 2018, the then environmental commissioner wrote a series of recommendations about how we can better protect our wetlands. And one of those was for conservation authorities to set up wetland offsetting policies to better review these proposals when they come forward. Hamilton doesn't have a wetland offsetting policy, so we can't necessarily say how these policies work. But one of the concerns we have is we've seen really a shift with this government, this provincial government particularly, changing the role of conservation authorities from one of protection to one of just permitting. So we are asking the auditor, Tyler Schultz, the new commissioner of the environment, to step in and review all of the offsetting policies that currently exist, as well as all of the applications since the change since his position became created, to make sure that this tool is being used as rarely and basically never as it's supposed to be by the people who kind of talked about it. So a wetland offsetting is really supposed to be when there's like a health and safety risk. It's completely unavoidable. This is going to flood on downstream community. Like, it should be pretty serious when we're talking about wetland offsetting. So we want to make sure, and we want the Auditor General, the Public Service of Ontario, to kind of step in and use their regulatory powers to help us out. But so we're also going to talk a little bit now, kind of zooming out. So we have our action. It's been posted in the chat. We're going to follow up with you over email. You're going to sign that petition. We're going to get all of this information sent to you. But it's really important to think that it's not just starting. Well, this is kind of the forefront of a larger issue of environment. I think a lot of us, many of us calling in tonight are from Ancaster, Dundas is where we live, because this is kind of our local water. Some of us are kind of spread throughout the city of Hamilton. But really, we're not the only ones doing water protection work. And in fact, we're not really on the front lines of water protection work across the world, and particularly locally where we live. So I think it's really important that as we ourselves are kind of building a relationship with our water, and we're thinking about how we can stand up for our local waterways, we're also acting in solidarity with folks who are standing up for water, across Turtle Island. So this is a photo of a march where a cease and desist was delivered from Six Nations Hereditary Council to Nestle Waters and Aberfoyle, basically saying, this is treaty land. There's really no legitimacy for stealing this water. There's folks who live on Six Nations who don't have regular access to clean drinking water in their home, yet their groundwater is being taken by a giant corporation, sold at profit in plastic bottles. And because we don't commodify water in Ontario, Nestle can do all of this for about $500 per million liters. So it's really just a license to print money. And the title holders of this land have issued a cease and desist. This is a campaign that's going to be rearing up because Nestle Waters has now sold to try and escape the scrutiny. So there's a new corporate owner with a new brand to trash. And so there's a lot of work kind of heating up in the next month. And this is something that we can also be lending our voices and lending our support to. Also kind of coming from Six Nations and the Haudenosaunee Hereditary Council there's a moratorium on development. And if we can all go to, and maybe Steph, you can help me by putting the Protect the Tract website in the chat. There's a moratorium on all development along the track, which is 6 miles on either side of the Grand. So think of like Brantford, think of Kitchener, think of Waterloo, think of 1492 Landback Lane, thinking of all these places. There's currently a call for no development without consent. So there's a real ask that all of these development proposals be going through a consent process. And when we think about how little voice we feel we have, not only is this just the morally right thing to do, not only does this kind of further reconciliation and those things, but it's also like, this is what's going to stop development. Like Indigenous people have showed time and time again that they're able to kind of go on the front lines of these developments, that land defense and water protection are not just important, but effective strategies at winning. So we can be lending our voices to these calls. And more locally, I got a text from Danielle, unfortunately, during this program, and she's just having a little bit of a health issue, so won't be able to join us tonight. But we're going to be hearing from Danielle a little bit on some of the work she's doing in Coutts Paradise as a local water walker. And I'm sure all of us are deeply familiar with the billions of liters of untreated sewage that went into Coutts Paradise, which is designated as a provincially significant wetland, which has gone through kind of the checks and balances of the provincial system. And this is what it got. I think it's really, really important that these inequities are being highlighted by local activists who are talking about building our relationship and building our connection with the water. And that's something I think we can all take on. So we're really hoping in future webinars, and this is kind of our commitment to you as an organizing team, to kind of keep bringing and centering these kind of campaigns and causes in our future webinars and keeping you informed. And our ask of all of you in turn is that you kind of get engaged with us. And we can be all lending our voices to these campaigns, because, you know, that's what's going to make the difference. So thank you all for kind of hearing this and kind of thinking about that broader context of water protection work that we're engaging in. Because while it's our local wetland, while it's our local stream, you know, while it's my house I'm worried about flooding, or Nancy's thinking about the birds that live right by her, this really kind of is happening from like a colonial context that says, you know, I have money, I can take this land, I can make money off of this land. Who cares about what's there? Who cares about what people benefit from it? And, you know, now that that system's impacting us, we're getting engaged, but that system's been impacting Indigenous folks since contact, since colonization began. Yeah. So with all of that said, we're really excited to hear from you. So I'm gonna kind of throw this around to some other folks, but Dawn, I think you actually, rather than you asking us a question, we actually have a question for some of our attendees first to get us started. And then we'll kind of go in there. So Dawn, do you want to take it away?
Well, the thing that I would like to pick up on at this point, and certainly with respect to the proposal that's before the Conservation Authority, as far as we can see, there has been no role at all allocated to or provided for Indigenous people with respect to this decision on whether or not to relocate the wetland. And that is a major problem. That is something that the Conservation Authority a number of years ago took some progressive steps in those directions, made an agreement with the Haudenosaunee, the Confederacy, to allow for traditional hunting on some of the Conservation Authority lands. It was not precedent setting, but pretty proactive in the Hamilton community, given the way in which Indigenous rights have been ignored and overridden. But with respect to this process that's underway here, there doesn't appear to be any attempt to include Indigenous voices, ask for permission from Indigenous people with respect to the treaty rights that are in place here. And that should be one of the things that is, I think people should be raising concerns about, specifically with the Conservation Authority Board. One of the other things that's happening with respect to Ancaster Creek, we're talking about the headwaters just south of Garner Road. It's the one that goes over Tiffany Falls, it goes over Sherman Falls. It works its way down along parallel to Main Street West and goes under Osler Drive, and then goes by the edge of McMaster University before it empties into Spencer Creek just before the Coots Drive Bridge. And in that situation in McMaster, there's been an initiative launched, and we have, I think, with us Judy Major Jayarden, who is a professor at McMaster, who has been working on developing and that's a good map that we've got up here. That so in the area of Coots Paradise, there is now an effort to expand the wetland areas and replace a parking lot, unpaved paradise, in the McMaster backyard. So I think Judy is on the call with us, and I'm hoping she can give us some explanation of what the project is and where it's at. Is Judy still with us?
Yes, sorry, I was muted there. I forgot to mute. Thanks very much, Dawn. I don't know if you want me to share a few slides or just talk for a couple of minutes about the project. I wasn't sure about your timing. What's your preference?
I think we could share a few slides. We have done something unusual here. We've actually pulled the main program together in under an hour for the first time in 5 tries. So let's see what you've got here.
Are you seeing my screen?
We are.
Okay. So my name is Judy Major Gerard, and I'm a professor in the School of the Arts at McMaster University. And my email is there if anybody would like to contact me to know more about this project. We're kind of the flip side of what we're talking about tonight, because we're starting with the parking lot that we're trying to uproot and restore some natural area. And it's in the initial planning and design stages. We are doing a feasibility study at the moment, and it's being called Watershed Trust at this stage of the game. And this is just a photograph of Coldwater Creek. So this Google map really shows, if you can see the curve of Coots Drive there, that's right where the McMaster West Campus sits. And it's really at the pinch point of this larger natural corridor that runs from the Royal Botanical Gardens on the right through to the Dundas Valley Conservation Area on the left. So we're in a kind of strategic place that really needs some renaturalizing in order to keep this, enhance this natural corridor. We're working with a eco-artist and landscape designer, Patricia Johansson, who's been doing this work for decades, trying to marry human infrastructure and balance that with the needs of nature. I'm just going to quickly show you a couple of her projects. This is one showing how she's created some pathways to allow people to enter the wetland and learn from it without disturbing the wetland. This is one of the most impactful projects from my perspective, where she took a sewage treatment plant and essentially has turned it into a public park with trails. It's become a bird sanctuary. People go there to paint, and it's a sewage treatment plant that serves 57,000 people. So here we are. This is our parking lot called Parking Lot M, which is in the floodplain along Coldwater Creek. And what we're trying to do is rethink this whole sort of West Campus area as a sort of green campus. And this is maybe a little happier story than we're talking about tonight, because I've been at McMaster for decades now, and I've seen incredible movement in the right direction by everyone at McMaster, students right up to administrators, in beginning to value sustainability and thinking about connecting the teaching and learning to the land and being aware of climate change and our role and our kind of civic responsibility towards all this. So it really is a great time, I think, for McMaster. They're valuing their natural lands. And so our landscape designer looked at this area and interpreted this really wonderful organic shape as a monarch butterfly in profile. And this is really just a different way of thinking of organizing the land. So rather than a grid, which is the normal urban system for dividing up and thinking about where you place things, she's thinking we will place things in this landscape according to this organic shape of a butterfly wing, and let that guide where pathways and ponds and other things occur. Just a couple of drawings showing what we're trying to do here is really create a wetland of mosaics. So a number of different wetland habitats created where this parking lot M sits, and hopefully to relocate the fill and create some earth sheltered buildings on other areas which are outside the floodplain. It's just a quick map showing the floodplain and how we're sort of trying to think about reestablishing wetland areas within the floodplain and moving fill outside of the floodplain to rethink this whole area. The area, this is a map created by one of our graduate students in biology, Noah Stegman, who did some research and mapped how water used to move through this valley over the last 100 years. And it's quite amazing to think how much water routes have changed as they move through this valley. Just a satellite map from drone photography. This is part of our feasibility study, which is underway right now. And we've also put in some ground water monitoring wells, which are collecting data. So we're well on our way. We've had some public charrettes to gather information, and the list down the side there is growing by the minute, but these are just some of the ideas that people have provided to us to think about as we go through this redesigning of the West Campus, of things that might occur there and that might be important to the community and to the university. It really will be a research and teaching a new sort of alternative place for teaching and learning at the university. So I'll stop sharing. I don't know if there's any questions.
I think we certainly would open the floor for questions, as that's the point we're at, I think, in terms of the presentation. I just wanted to remind folks that behind McMaster, it's called Coldwater Creek, but that is Ancaster Creek as well. It has two names, and the reason it's called Coldwater Creek is that it was, at least in its upper reaches, a cold water creek, a very rare type of creek, which will provide habitat for species that can't survive in the overheated creeks that generally exist in urban areas in Ontario.
That's right. And the McMaster property, the escarpment on the McMaster property has several cold water springs that come off that hill and drain into this valley. So it's got great potential for enhancing a wetland.
And yeah, so with that, we'll kind of switch over to questions, but I will say, you know, something to keep in mind is we're talking about enhancing wetlands. And I think enhancing wetlands in their original location or bringing previously paved over wetlands back is so exciting. But, you know, the proponent also uses the language of enhancement here when they're talking about moving it. So it's something to really show. Thank you, Judy, for showing us what enhancement really looks like. Because, you know, what we're seeing in the proposal submitted to the Hamilton Conservation Authority just isn't that. So thank you so much. And yeah, with that, Steph generally takes a big role in helping us out with the Q&A. So Steph, are you comfortable doing that again with us tonight?
I'm comfortable with that, absolutely. And I do have a few questions lined up. I just wanted to let a couple people know, aka you and Jim mostly, that there are unfortunately people in the waiting room. And there it is. I lost my co-host because I had to sign off. So I can admit now. And I'm just going to say I'm very, very sorry to the people that have been kept in the waiting room for the last bit now. Unfortunately, we both didn't recognize it and I lost the ability to let people in. So we're very sorry. Fortunately, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared on our social media and website and YouTube channel. But we are going into the Q&A now. So if you have any questions, which might be difficult if you didn't hear what we're talking about, let us know. I've got 3 questions lined up first here. So I'm going to start with Stan, Catherine, and Wayne. But after that, if there's anything you're unaware of, or maybe even just want a brief summary of what you might have missed, we can see what we can do. So does that make sense, Alex, to you? Wonderful. All right, Stan, you're up. If you're with us here still.
Hi, everybody. Wow, this is great to be a part of it. Boy, oh boy, I'm glad we're all on the same side here. Yeah, I have a few questions. I'm going to tie one in together. Now, Cootes Paradise is a crown preserve. You know, it's been a crown preserve. Are such designations possible for wetlands, even as small as the one we're talking about? Something that'll make it legally impossible. Is that a federal initiative, I guess? And the other one is when a man-made system is built, how much time is needed in general before a man-made wetland / retention pond is considered complete and so ready to be functionable before construction starts?
I can start you off there, Stan, but I'll throw it over to some other folks because we've had the same questions. So in an attempt to answer those questions for tonight, I'm going to say something that Dawn says, and that really makes me laugh. There's 3 types of wetlands in Ontario. There's provincially significant, there's locally significant, and there's unassessed. So, you know, I think that really speaks to, there are some policy tools that exist, primarily at the provincial level, that, you know, you can have something classified as a provincially significant, or at the federal level, there's some scientific, like of natural interest to like scientific study. You know, we are seeing that those aren't perfect, you know, sewage is flowing into Cootes, but there certainly are enhanced protections for wetlands, and really like Duffins Creek should have been protected as a provincially significant wetland, but the province, you know, was ready to go. So I think, as Sandy mentioned, there's always a role for people to, you know, it's never just as easy as a one and done. Like, we always have to stand up for our water. John or Jim may be able to kind of help out with your other question yeah, about like how long it takes, because that's another question we had where we asked some conservation authority experts.
Stan, I would argue that it takes a very long time, and it's sort of staged because, you know, you've got, especially in this project where they're basically going to be building a stormwater retention pond. It's not a marsh. And it will, if it ever becomes a marsh, it will take a lot of successional changes to get to that stage. It will be amazing if the species that are living in that marsh find their way over to this future marsh, if it ever becomes a marsh again. So it's really not very well known, and it's not well monitored yet. I know that the Conservation Authority, at least Scott Peck, is interested in starting to look at these kinds of questions. They've done a bit of work at TRCA, but it's going to be many years before it approaches what that marsh is in terms of, you know, being full of plants and sequestering carbon and holding on to water and mitigating flooding and all of those kinds of things. It's going to be a pond for a long time.
So a storm retention pond, by its definition, would be quicker to establish. Now,
you dig a hole.
Yeah, you dig a hole.
Yeah. They're required to do that, Stan. If you do a development, you're now required to ensure that the stormwater flows at peak flow in a major storm are not exceeded as a result of the impervious surfaces that you're putting in place. And in this particular proposal, as it's being presented by the developers, they're going to make almost the entire property impervious and squeeze a stormwater pond and what they're calling a new wetland down along the edge between 5 warehouses and parking for 3,000 people on one side, and the Highway 6 extension, which is being widened to 4 lanes on the other side. So if you happen to be lucky enough as a salamander or a frog to find your way to this new wetland, which is going to take quite a long time to get established, if you try to leave, you're going to get run over. Basically, there's no way out of there. While they designate on their maps a stormwater pond as separate from their relocated wetland, effectively, they're both stormwater ponds. And what's going to flow into them is going to be a lot of contaminated water if you're going to have the number of vehicles they're talking about. And I'm putting all of this in a bit of air quotes because the proposal that's in front of the Conservation Authority hasn't been vetted by anybody. And the Conservation Authority has no ability to hold them to whatever it is they're proposing. They've simply put together something, in my view, which looks like, well, of course you can't turn it down. This is 3,000 jobs. This is $250 million investment. Of course, everybody's going to be in favor of this. How could you possibly let some silly little wetland block this from happening? But of course, just as well, if in fact there's somebody who wants 5 warehouses in Hamilton and thinks that they can employ 600 people in each, there is a lot of land available to do that. The city just completed last December an examination of what lands it would need for employment and what lands it would need for residential development. And the residential one we talked about a bit earlier as the Stop Sprawl movement. But the employment lands, they have calculated that by 2051, we will still have a surplus of lands for employment, for warehousing and that sort of thing. We've got more than we need, and we've got more than we need for the next 30 years. So it's very easy to simply say to this developer, I'm sure you would like to have these lands converted to, move the wetland out of the way because that'll increase the value of the lands. And you may well then sell it to somebody else for who knows what. But the actual project, the actual jobs and employment and so on that they're telling the story about could happen in a whole lot of different locations. It just would enrich a different landowner than this particular one. And this particular one, as we know, is not very wealthy. He's got a house next door, which is on the market right now for $49 million.
What? Wow.
This is a 30,000 foot mansion I think it's got 16 parking garages. They suggested in the newspaper article that the kinds of events that you could hold at the White House could be held here.
They can turn it into a warehouse there. And then some.
It was meant to be a golf course.
Yeah, well, those are my thoughts too, Stan. And
I'm sorry, I'm monopolizing. That's it for me.
No, that's okay. That was my thought too. Like, if only we had $49 million, we could band together, buy this place, and let the wetland take it back over. We just had a few more people join us, so thank you so much for joining us. We're in the question and answer portion of this webinar now. We've got a couple more questions lined up, but after that, if you have questions, for example, what did you miss? Because unfortunately, this is close to the end now. You're welcome to share them either in the chat or we'll have hands up after these next couple of questions. But I'm going to move on now to Catherine. Catherine had a good question. Are you still with us, Catherine?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. And thank you, Alex and Stephanie, for that, and Dawn and Dr. Quinn for providing excellent information. I've got my letter already in my head and the key points that I'll put in, but I was wondering if it would assist getting this out a bit more publicly by sending our letters to maybe the Hamilton Spectator or the local news. You know, if maybe a few people sent their letters in, then it might get some traction.
Catherine, but still my heart. That's exactly what I've been talking about all afternoon. So we were just planning our kind of campaign, and we have a few media releases, and we're trying to do some exciting things in the next couple of days to like do that as 350. But you know, time and time again, I think we've seen that when folks say, "Hi, I'm a Spec subscriber. This is the coverage I want to see," it works. When folks say, "This is something I care about. Can you please talk about it?" It works. So we try to keep it short and simple in terms of like the actions you can take, but there's certainly more than 4 things you can do. And getting in touch with local media is such a great one.
And if I can add to that, when we did the site visit last night, one of the people who was with us is a reporter for Hamilton News, which is part of the Hamilton Spectator conglomerate. And his articles have appeared in the Spectator. He's written 2 so far on this issue. Quite comprehensive and quite thorough. And I assume that he's writing a 3rd one at this point. It may already be posted. His name is Richard Leitner. So the Spectator has the material. They don't have to even go look for it. They've got a very competent reporter who's doing work on this. They just have to be encouraged to put that in the newspaper rather than just one of the weeklies that get dumped on the doorsteps.
Fantastic. So I think that answered that question for you, Catherine. Was that straightforward?
Yeah.
Great idea. And thank you very much for bringing that up. And that's why I wanted you to ask that, because Alex has been so all over that day, like telling us to do just what you're suggesting. So thanks for bringing that up for us. I have a final question from Wayne, and then Jennifer, I do see your hand up. So if you're comfortable, I'm going to go to Wayne and then we'll follow up with you if that works.
My understanding is that Brad Clark has recused himself from voting at the board meeting, and I respect that. He's been very forward and upfront with that. My question is, does anyone have any suspicion, or are they aware of any conflict or conflicts of interest with the developer, such as contributions to the Conservation Authority?
Somebody wants, I can jump in on that to some extent. The way in which the official conflict of interest laws operate is you cannot make money off an application in front of you. You need to declare a conflict of interest, or if somebody in your family is financially engaged with that, you need to declare a conflict of interest. But that's just what the legal structure says at this point. We know, for example, that many of our city councilors have been recipients of campaign donations from people who are then turning up in front of city council or in front of the Conservation Authority, where half the members are from city council, and asking for, making proposals like this, asking for favors and whatever. We have also some interesting laws in Hamilton with respect to lobbying. A number of years ago, as a result of public pressure, and particularly as a result of the scandal around the monies accepted illegally by a former mayor, Hamilton agreed to put in place a lobbyist registry. But they introduced toward the end of that process, they introduced some interesting features to that. And one of them is that if you don't have to register as being a lobbyist if you are lobbying the councillor whose ward you live in or have a business in. So if you are the ones who are bringing forward this proposal in Ancaster for a paving portion of wetland area and part of the headwaters of Ancaster Creek, you wouldn't have to register as a lobbyist with Mr. Ferguson, who is the councillor in Ancaster and who is also the chair of the Conservation Authority. So there wouldn't be a record of that. The lobbyist registry in Hamilton doesn't give you a whole lot more than just a record of who is officially identified themselves as a lobbyist and is actually trying to get something to happen. It doesn't give you much detail on what they're trying to get. But in terms of actually identifying even who may be lobbying the Ancaster councillor, the chair of the Conservation Authority at this point, if they're doing a project in Ancaster, they're a business in Ancaster as a result, or if they're a resident of Ancaster, Nancy wouldn't have to register either because she's a resident of Ancaster, but that's a bit of a different thing. So it's tricky to identify the actual potential flow of the money, but it's certainly useful to try to find out how the money flows. Hope that is helpful.
Did that answer your question, Wayne?
I just put in the chat that the Silvestri family are the owners of the land, and they have been regular donors to the Hamilton Conservation Authority. And that's a question I have, because I'm not sure exactly which date, but a couple of years ago, they were registered as donors between 500,000 and $1 million, because every donation letter block shows on the donor wall of the Hamilton Conservation Foundation. And I'll put the link to that because there's a very lengthy list of donors, and somebody here on this webinar might actually recognize a name. And those people may not know that the donations that they're sending to the Hamilton Conservation Authority could very well end up going towards a conservation authority whose board decides to pave a wetland.
And that's one of the things I was raising before, is that there's a reputational issue here. The conservation authorities have played a very positive role. In the case of the Spencer Creek watershed, Hamilton Conservation Authority has about 1,100 acres of land that's publicly accessible, protected lands. This has been a huge benefit during the pandemic, but it's a huge benefit generally. And lots of people who want to see land protected have turned to the Conservation Authority, donated money to them, or even donated lands to them. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important that the Conservation Authority continue to be a defender of conservation and not become identified as somebody who agrees with paving wetlands.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for all that information, Don. Did that pretty much answer your question, Wayne? Okay, I'm going to assume it does, but
yes,
feel
it
free
does,
to message.
Stephanie. Thanks.
No, not a problem. That's fantastic. So I've got a couple more questions in line here. Jennifer, you've been waiting very patiently. I appreciate that. You are welcome to go. You have
okay, well, okay, I missed the first part. And I'm actually an Ancaster resident living down here in Dundas. But I don't know if everyone knows it up in Ancaster, and Ancaster is just being paved over. I spoke up about the park behind St. John's Church being developed and use the Joni Mitchell. You can't pave over paradise, make a parking lot. But anyway, the question is whether the Silvestri family would be interested in donating the land and having a natural park put in their name. Okay.
Good idea.
You know, it like, okay, because they're big developers and, you know, call it the Silvestri, Sylvan, whatever, you know, they could have their name out there forever in a nice way. Okay. The other thing is, I attended a Greenbelt development meeting at the Morgan Firestone years ago. And basically they were just interested in trading one area for another. And the developers were out there saying, well, why can't I develop my land? I have to have it under a crop. Anyway, so there's something going on with that Greenbelt. The other thing is social media. So Facebook, Twitter, change.org. I've signed something about the Oak Ridge Moraine, and they were very successful in stopping development there. It's a bigger land tract, but I wonder if you're contacting them to see how they went about stopping that development. And the other thing is thinking outside the box, trading, rather than developing kind of virgin land, why don't they take industrial land and build another warehouse? So along Longwood, although that's MAC land on the other side by the railroad tracks, I mean, that was industrial. And then there are a lot of warehouses or businesses up for sale along the QEW between here and Mississauga. So why do we have to use green space? Anyway, that's my little shtick.
These are great suggestions. And if someone thinks that they can make a connection with the Silvestri family and suggest that this would be a better outcome, perhaps that's something that they might consider if their application gets turned down on June 3rd of the Conservation Authority. And as for putting warehouses elsewhere, we have a very large old industrial sector in Hamilton along Burlington Street. And that's actually a much better location. It's very close to major highways. It's also relatively close to people who are more likely to be employees of warehousing. And it's on land that nobody is going to launch a movement to protect the contamination that has been left behind by industrial facilities. It's also right on the water, and that means that you can use water transportation or rail transportation, which runs right through it, as a much better way to move goods than the trucking industry that is this one in Ancaster is being based around. We looked at this proposal, and we haven't talked a whole lot about what it might mean as just as a proposal without the wetland relocation. But it looks pretty strange to be putting that number of employees on Garner Road and that number of trucks servicing it. The mapping that the developers have provided shows dozens of truck bays. So a lot of heavy trucks coming into there, and we're trying to figure out how they would get in, how they get out, what that would mean to the people who live nearby, what it would mean to Garner Road traffic. This is also an area where transit is extremely weak at this point. There was a proposal to improve it 3 or 4 years ago, and it was blocked by the Ancaster councillor, Mr. Ferguson, at that point, on the basis that nobody rides buses, and he doesn't want any more buses in Ancaster than there already. There's a bunch of problems associated with this particular location that are additional to the proposal to relocate the wetland or pave over the wetland, pave over headwaters areas. And that would mean that the waters flowing into Ancaster Creek are going to be a lot more contaminated as a result.
You know, it's unfortunate if Silvestri could be convinced to just name it after himself. It's the wrong type of wetland. It would be better to be able to call it the Silvestri Swamp, I think.
But okay, I do not know them, but I believe they've lost a grandchild. Okay. Years ago. So something in honor of that, of the family member that they lost. And I don't know the person who gave that lovely presentation about developing around Mac, but perhaps drawing up something like that, the beautiful butterfly or something, and steering them away from selling.
These are really useful ideas, and if somebody is able to pursue them, I don't have a direct, and I'm not sure any of us have a direct connection with the Silvestri family, but maybe they will hear about this, or maybe somebody on the call has a possibility to suggest to them that these lands could be utilized for a great public purpose rather than for the purpose that is being proposed. The group that's proposing it is not presenting itself as Silvestri. I think the lands are still in their hands, but the proposal is under a group called
One Properties.
One Properties or something. But that's not unusual for a development that they don't necessarily follow. They create a new name for each development.
All right, that was a bunch of really wonderful suggestions, Jennifer. Thank you so much, and thank you very much, Dawn and Jim, for reaching out and answering those questions. Very good joke, Jim. Like a lot. Ginny, I see you have your hand up. I do have one other person asking a question, so I'm just going to ask you: is your question specific to what we were just talking about? Because otherwise, I'm going to. Okay, Ginny, you go ahead then, and then I believe Dan will be next after you then.
Dawn, you were suggesting that a lot of the lands that are already available down like on Barton Street and that sort of thing could be an alternative. But I thought they wanted it up there because, it's going to be stuff coming in from the airport. So we want to be close. They want to be close to the airport, the really big polluters, bring the airplanes in, then put on the trucks, then send it around. But I actually thought that was the marriage. Is that not right?
That's probably will be presented as an argument. The actual location isn't very good. It's not immediately accessible to the airport. You've got to sort of do quite a run around with your trucks to get to and from the airport. But if you've actually got any kind of sense of where the world is going with respect to the climate emergency, airports aren't the place that we want to be heading. We want to be heading in directions, if we're moving goods, to move them by rail or move them by water. And the old industrial areas of Hamilton would be much better suited for that purpose. If you want to move them through the airport, you don't have any rail connections up there. The highway connections are somewhat limited. 403 goes up around there. But the area down along Burlington Street, I would argue, would be a better spot. But I suspect, yes, the main reason that these lands are being selected here, I think, is they are not old industrial lands. They are the kind of lands which developers love. They're flat. There's a bit of a depression in the middle there called a marsh. They have to find a way to get out of the way. But other than that, the location is ideal for them. It's not ideal for the people who will work there, who will have to travel a distance to get there and will have, or go by bus because the wages will probably be very low. And, warehousing 600 people, I suspect we're going to see a lot of robots in there instead, if in fact that proposal goes ahead. So there's a bunch of issues that float around this. We try to concentrate particularly on the problem of the precedent setting measure that's coming before here. And they've tried to argue in their application that the Conservation Authority has approved relocating wetlands before. The staff report has refuted that, but it's very clear that if in fact a decision on June 3rd goes in favor of the developers, then the door is cracked wide open for relocating wetlands, getting streams and other natural features out of the way to make it easier for and cheaper for development to take place. So this is a pretty critical piece, even though it's a relatively small wetland compared to, this is about a little under 2 hectares is the size of the wetland.
I know we have another question. Ginny, are you okay if I just jump in really quickly?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's just something to add is like, there's no study that says Hamilton needs wetland, warehouses. There is studies that say Hamilton needs wetlands. There's no studies that say, oh, we need a warehouse to solve this employment need. Like, to connect to some of the stuff that Sandy was saying and to connect to some things that Linda Lukasik, the executive director of Environment Hamilton and a PhD in urban planning, has said, is that this is like a land grab. Like this is because we can put forward like a proposal to make money off warehouses. That's what we're seeing. I'm sure if a Ferris wheel could make a lot of money, this would be a proposal for a Ferris wheel. But we have a provincial government and we have like a political context that's really incentivizing these types of things. And so I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing it. And it's not really the Conservation Authority's job, despite what Lloyd Ferguson may or may not think, to evaluate this as an employment proposal. The job of the Conservation Authority is to evaluate the environmental significance of this, and Hamilton City Council should be weighing in on the Hamilton City Council parts of this concern. And we're a little worried that Lloyd may be mixing up his 2 jobs here. And that's of deep concern.
So I was just going to build on what you were saying, Alex. I mean, it's essentially the same thing that we, are engaging in a good faith argument. Oh, that you say you're going to do is create employment lands. And so here we are arguing about proposing other solutions about what, employment lands would be better placed and suited. And we get distracted from, or take our eye off the prize, which this is simply, these are political promises, essentially. I mean, it's a red herring that there's going to be all these jobs that are going to fall from the sky. May or may not be the case. There's no connection, from my understanding, from when they're allowed to slide over the wetland, or whether they can rezone the wetland. There's nothing stopping them from reselling it, because that's the game. The game is to get this property, across Ontario, to get things rezoned, to get urban boundaries pushed out, to get highways built along land that is already owned by developers. All of this is about an instant opportunity to multiply by, multiply the value of that land tenfold instantly. They don't even have to put a shovel in the ground before they can benefit from this change. So I just want to caution, I don't know, maybe I'm sounding a little cynical, but I just want to caution that let's not get too hooked up in answering the problems for them about where you should better put employment lands, because that may not even ever be their intention. Their intention is to get rid of, a wetland that is, as someone described, a hole in a donut, because then the land is way more valuable. So my point being that, and Alex said it as well, like, don't lose sight of what we're talking about here. The Hamilton Conservation Authority's job is to protect natural heritage. The councillors on the board, that is their job. And don't mix the two, because you'll dilute your argument that way.
Yeah, I agreed entirely. And the councillors who are sitting on the Conservation Authority board are mandated and basically required to act on the Conservation Authority mandate, even though they're city councillors. When they put their hat on for a city council meeting, they can do something else, and they can argue about economic development and whatever. So one of the questions that's sitting out here is who's on the Conservation Authority board, and are these the conservationists that we would like to see sitting on the board? Because the councillors that I see the names of there are not people, from my observation of council for the last 20 years, that have been outspoken defenders of protection of natural areas, outspoken defenders of acquiring more natural features for the public good. They're not in any way people who would be described as conservationists, with the exception of Brad Clark. But the other 4 are not, don't have that reputation, and it's curious that they are the ones who have been selected to sit on the Conservation Authority board.
And who selected them?
It's a interesting process. It's certainly partly self-selection. The city council decides who sits on what committee, and They make requests, and seniority has something to do with these things generally. And in terms of the citizens who sit on there, they are selected by the councilors, by a committee called the Selection Committee. I spent half an hour a couple of days ago going through the minutes of the Selection Committee for the first half year after these folks were at the point when people were being nominated and put on the Conservation Authority Board back in 2018, when this council was first in office. And all the minutes are essentially, they have nothing in them. All the meetings are entirely in camera. And as a result, it's very hard to figure out who got selected for what reason. Were there good people who were tossed aside because somebody else would be more amenable to development? It's a very difficult, and it's an issue that I think we'll be looking at somewhere along the way here as well.
Thank you.
Well, that was a great question with lots of conversation. Thanks so much, Alex and Sandy, Don, of course, for weighing in on that. Very appreciated. I've seen Robert's hand jumping up and down a bit. Robert, I'm not sure if you want to ask a question or if it's specific to this. If it is specific to this, this is going to be the final question for this, and then we're going to move on, just because we have a couple people in line, but we can come back to it after those people have had a chance to speak what they'd like to say. So Robert, go ahead if you've got something you'd like to ask here.
Yeah, I have something I'd like to ask, but it's not specific to that, but it does relate to this whole thing.
You just got muted there, Rob.
One of the principles of these infrastructure from an engineering point of view is that whenever you're doing an infrastructure changeover of any kind, you construct the new and you build it while the old is continuing to operate and continuing to function. A new bridge, a new roadway, a new passage for sewage, whatever it is. And once you get the new functioning and running and operating and proving that it can do the job that the other one did, then you can commission it and you can take out of service the old. And I wonder if in trying to introduce a best practices procedure for environmental things, including this wetland thing, somehow or other we couldn't work towards or advocate for a best practices which would say that if you need to relocate some kind of a wetland, that you take the 15 or 20 years it takes to construct your new area, get it functioning, get it collecting the water that the other one did, see that the environmental thing is all properly working. And when and if you can prove that your new system is working, then you can decommission the old wetland and you can pave it over and put your warehouse on it. Somehow or other, we have to establish the fact that you can't pave something over and then guess, and by golly, you're going to accomplish what the old one did. I find this unfathomable that we can't use basic engineering protocols to get these things done.
I think that's an excellent point, and I hope that maybe the Conservation Authority would consider putting something like that in their policy, because they're working on a policy statement for these land swaps, and that would be an excellent suggestion to include.
Oh, that's a good idea.
And that is, we're being told, will be out to the public in the next week or so. It's been delayed, but it's now, I was in conversation, we got information from the staff that they're close to being able to put this out. And it's a draft policy for wetland offsetting. Whether or not the Conservation Authority wants to end up adopting a policy like that, but at least the details of the policy are coming out for public consultation. So there's an opportunity, and we will be letting everyone know when that opportunity is there and how they can participate in that. And the suggestion you made, Robert, is a really good one, and I agree certainly with Jim.
Yeah, I would think that if they're coming out with a policy on how to do these things, that idea, such as I suggested, would have to shame them into realizing that any other policies they have are shambles unless they're going to work on a basic principle of establish the new and decommission the old when you've got the new operating. makes sense.
Good.
Don, is there any way, are you going to be receiving that policy?
The policy, the draft policy was included in the April 1st meeting agenda for the Conservation Authority. And the decision there was to hold public consultation through the summer and bring it back to the authority board for a decision in the fall. So it is accessible at this point. I think there may be a bit of modification as a result of comments that were made at the April 1st meeting. So we will be able to circulate at least a link to that. It's a fairly substantial paper that the Conservation Authority staff have put together.
If you would send that to me, I might manage to get myself interested in seeing what I can do to get something going on that.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Robert. That's, as they were saying, a great idea. And we've got a lot of really great ideas in the chat as well of things that we can do. So thanks to everyone so much for stepping up and showing your enthusiasm and being willing to be feet on the ground on this for this. This is very, very excellent. We really appreciate it. Diane has been waiting very patiently. I appreciate it, Diane. So if you'd like to ask your question now, you may go ahead.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Stephanie. So my question is, why doesn't Councillor Ferguson have to recuse himself?
You comfortable speaking to that, Don?
The best person to answer that would be Mr. Ferguson himself. The law, as I understand it, is that if he thinks he's not going to make money off this, or anybody in his family is going to make money off it, then he doesn't have to. He's not in a legal conflict of interest according to the weak conflict of interest rules we have, and that doesn't include receiving campaign donations. Campaign donations, to me, if you get money from somebody and they then appear in front of you and want a favor, you should recuse yourself. But that has not been the practice, and it's not, as I understand it, a legal requirement.
That answer the question for you, Diane?
But it's a good question to ask, for sure.
Absolutely. And if you're comfortable asking that question in a letter, you're more than welcome to do so, I believe. Perhaps I shouldn't be suggesting things like that. Sorry if I misspoke on that one. We have one other question lined up for now, and it's from, oh, I've forgotten your name now. I think it's Jackson. I apologize if I'm incorrect on that one.
Oh, you got it.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everyone. Jackson Hudecki. I am on the board with the Hamilton Naturalist Club, along with Gord McNulty, who I saw here tonight. I guess one thing I thought of, and I put it in the chat earlier, was just like, I know that we've done the natural areas inventory project in the past, which highlighted all of the significant areas in the Hamilton boundaries. I guess I'm just becoming increasingly more worried about those spaces. You know, like how do we pinpoint those spots so that we know they're not going to get developed on down the road? I know this is a kind of a private land that we're talking about here. So, I mean, is there, like, what kind of efforts can be made towards ensuring that, you know, I'm thinking of, there's been a lot of talk about the Falkirk properties, which is kind of just off of Stone Church and Upper Paradise. I was birding there on the weekend, and it is quite a hotspot in there for biodiversity. So I guess I'm just worried that spaces like that can just get gobbled up because it's not about biodiversity. It's not about wildlife. Those are hindrances to people who just want to earn money. They don't care about bats. They don't care about salamanders. Like, they see no value in keeping those around, which is why they think it's as simple as just moving a wetland. You know, it hasn't been ingrained in them the importance of that. So this is all my roundabout way of saying, like, how do we ensure that we are looking at those spaces so that they never get developed on down the road?
I can start this off, but I think this would also be a really good one for folks to suggest their things in the chat, because this is something we talk about at the Conservation Matters table all the time, is like, where are we going? we're watching, we're getting this information, we're doing some data collection, we're doing some amateur journalism that's kind of, you know, a lot of journalists have started covering environmental issues, but when we started, you know, 6 months ago, the coverage was just not what it is now. So we welcome folks kind of joining in. But a couple of things that come to mind for me are land back. We can be really thinking about how do we currently, like what's our current system? Where did it come from? And it evolved from kind of like a colonial procedure. So how can we kind of create a new system? I think we're watching the Conservation Authority, and we really, really are thankful for the work of dedicated staff, but we're not sure that we're not sure the board structure is helping. So I think we've talked about the 2022 municipal elections a lot as a chance to hear those bold ideas. At like other levels of government, we hear these ideas about like a Green New Deal is something I'll speak personally that I get excited about. So like, where's our Green New Deal for biodiversity? Where's our Green New Deal for conservation? Where's our land back policy? Like those types of things I think can help. But in the meantime, as we kind of build those alternatives and we figure out where we're heading, I think like help us watch some conservation authorities. Like let's get in the know. Is I think our first step, and that's what we said is kind of we need to like understand the process better. So we started watching it. And from that, we're trying to kind of get to the point that you are. So maybe folks have answers or this prompted something for them, but I think you've just highlighted the core struggle of what we talk about in our meetings.
I agree entirely, and the Naturalist Club has done astounding work in Hamilton to identify the natural features that we have, the species at risk, the inventories that have been done. We've gone, I think, 3 complete inventories. They succeeded in convincing the city to utilize that information as the basis for their natural heritage protection policies. One of the reasons why we're able to even have a battle about this wetland is there are protection policies exist. They have been the result of earlier efforts that said, you know, how can we agree to continue to destroy wetlands? They're so critical. They are the most productive ecosystem we have on lands, and therefore they're the best sink for carbon dioxide and one of the best ways of dealing with too much carbon in our atmosphere. So the opportunity that we get from watching this process and intervening in this process to the extent that we can, both helps address the threat, potentially block that threat, but it also exposes the weakness of the rules that are in place at this point. That at the end of the day, it seems like these developments just charge on ahead. But in this situation, there is a marsh there. And as the result of there being a marsh there, the owner actually has to convince the Conservation Authority to allow them to relocate that marsh in order to proceed with a legal development. And that's a positive step. The identification of these areas, which the Naturalist Club has done so much work on over the years, has been a critical way in which we've been able to ensure that there's at least a battle about development in each of these locations that should not be being developed but are threatened in various ways. And the Naturalist Club has also been a major donor to the conservation authorities, not just the Hamilton one, but others as well. And donors have some influence. And that's why someone, Stephanie or Nancy, put up before who the donors are to the Conservation Authority. Those are the kinds of people who may well be most influential in making, in convincing the Conservation Authority board that the path they're on is not a good one. When this idea of wetland offsetting came up at the April meeting of the Conservation Authority, the head of the Conservation Foundation, there's a Hamilton Conservation Foundation, which is their fundraising arm, expressed concerns about moving in that direction. And they recognized that it's going to be harder to get donations and financial support and public support generally if the Conservation Authority starts to down a path of abandoning the responsibilities that has been given to protect the environment and to ensure minimum flooding and so on.
I would have to add something to that, and that has to do with what you were talking about, Jackson, the biodiversity. The only thing that we can really come at these people with, and they don't pay attention to it, is ecosystem services and the value of ecosystem services. And frankly, the value of biodiversity is so underplayed, and it's something that I have frankly been frustrated with as an environmentalist, because when you get into this game, you fight for nature and for those sorts of things, but it's under the auspices of humans mostly, and all you can think of is, well, if it's good for the health of humans, maybe it'll benefit the biodiversity of the world. And it's the one thing that's frustrated me about, and I'm not accusing everyone of this, but generally speaking, when we're talking about environmentalism, we forget about our animal and plant friends, and we focus primarily on Homo sapiens. And it's a shame that we do that, but I think more and more we're going to have to pay more attention to biodiversity issues, and not just ecosystem services and ways we can save ourselves some money in terms of filtering water and so on.
Yeah, I heard in a council meeting, one of the councilors kind of was like, "Yeah, that's great. You're doing all that stuff for the birds and the bees and all those things and blah blah blah," and they just kind of like skirt over it. They just kind of paint it with this cute brush that's like, "Oh, isn't it great we have turtles?" I guess. Like, so that's why I kind of said in the chat, maybe we just haven't done a good enough job in the ways that we have talked about, the importance of all this wildlife around us, and that needs to get ramped up a little bit more. I don't know how that is necessarily, but that's just part of putting our thinking caps on. So anyways, I appreciate the work that everyone has been doing thus far. I say that every time I get on any of these meetings, because I look at faces of people who have been trying their hardest and for decades. So I just want to say that there are folks like me out there, and others, of course, who will also be, wanting to take this fight on for years to come. So thank you for all that you've done.
Well, thanks so very much, Jackson. And some of us here are certainly newer to the game, but as you can see, there are definitely individuals here that have indeed been fighting for years, like you suggested. Thank you for your input. Thank you for your ideas. It's very helpful. We've had, again, as I said before, a lot of great ideas tonight. And one of them came from someone who had to leave. And I have said to her before she left that I'm not sure we are comfortable fully speaking to this, because we have a few different organizations presenting tonight. She thought, what if we did a march like Duffins Creek? They did in Duffins Creek. And someone else mentioned that Wellington Water Watchers said the power is in the people and having a very kind of overwhelming presence. So I don't know if we're at the state right now where we need to start thinking about a march or whatever, but that was put out there. And if anyone would like to speak to that, that'd be great. And if you don't, I understand, because again, I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here, but I thought I'd throw that out there.
I was at the Duffins Creek March, and it was really well organized. There was a lot of people there. They had a candidate from the Green Party speak. It was socially distanced. Everybody walked in, the maximum amount of groups, I think it was 10. There was a big space between the next one, and we just all walk along the main street, which I don't even know where that was. I just followed the crowd. I was walking next to someone dressed as a mermaid. So people were really in the spirit. I would say it's an awesome idea. I think maybe we wait and see how they vote on Tuesday, or I don't know, hopefully the pressure that we're putting on right now will be enough to, but Dawn knows that this is a special type of hearing. This is called a Section 28 hearing. And Dawn, maybe you can speak to this, but it seems like when these sorts of hearings have happened in the past, not once has the board voted the right way. So if they do vote the right way this time, it'll be the first one. Is that correct, Don?
I'm not familiar enough with all of the decisions that they've made, but this is a Section 28 hearing. One of the features of it is that while some of us have registered to speak to the Conservation Authority Board, we won't be part of the hearing itself. The hearing is limited to the proponent and the staff and the board members who can ask questions of the staff and the proponent. And they then go in camera and decide on what their make their decision there. So there'll be, if we will circulate a link for people to be able to watch the meeting, but being able to watch the decision itself will not be something you get to see or anybody else gets to see who isn't actually part of the board. And that at a recent meeting, I think, or maybe it was during one of our earlier webinars, the Deputy Director, Chief Planner of the Conservation Authority, Scott Peck, who you saw earlier in the webinar, if you were here for the whole thing tonight or in one of the earlier webinars, indicated that there had not been a situation in which staff brought an issue before the board about whether or not to approve something. In all cases, they approved it. I'm not sure that that's exactly what kind of situation we have here. Staff do sometimes recommend against, and sometimes they recommend for, and sometimes they say it's up to the board, we can't decide. There was one of those in April. So we could have a decision that doesn't follow that pattern because it isn't exactly the same kind of situation. I haven't gone back and looked at the 10 or 12 things that have happened in the last decade in which a Section 28 hearing has been held by the Conservation Authority Board.
I just wanted to say thanks to everyone for coming out. I'm going to have to depart, but also to Nancy. I interviewed that mermaid at that event. At least I think it was the same mermaid. Maybe there were two of them, but she spoke very eloquently. See y'all.
Before you leave, Dawn, Jim, sorry, I had to sign off, so I don't have co-host status anymore.
Oh,
and Alex
okay.
has left as well. So yeah, if you leave, it will end the meeting.
I'll put you back on.
Okay.
Cool.
I see Anne has her hand up.
Yeah.
What was the other thing? Yes.
Thank you. Another great session. Thank you so much. Dawn, what happens if this is approved? What's the next step for us to take? Can we then appeal, or what is the next procedure? Or is that it?
I don't think that's it. In normal processes like this, there is an appeal procedure, whether it is a potential one that's accessible or would require some legal challenge on the basis that the decision was made illegally in some way. But the proposal for relocating the wetland or making changes to the stream flow can't just rest with the Conservation Authority. This proposal has been identified by the staff in their report as premature. And it's premature in a couple of ways. One being that the Conservation Authority doesn't have a policy yet on whether they will ever accept wetland relocation. That policy is what's supposed to be being discussed this summer. But in addition, this proposal that comes in front of the Conservation Authority on June 3rd has not gone through city planners. The normal process is that if you want to do a development on land, you go to the city and you make your application there and you define your project. And the city then decides, do we need a transportation study? Do we need a sewage plan here? Do we need a stormwater plan? What kinds of things are necessary? And in this case, the city planners would have probably said to the developers, before you get a full approval on this, we're going to have to run this by the Conservation Authority to see if they're willing to agree to a relocation of the wetland. But in this case, they flipped the process. They've come to the Conservation Authority first. And as a result, nothing they say to the Conservation Authority is carved in stone. It can all disappear the next day. And this may just be a plan to get this thing out of the way so somebody can move a proposal to build houses on it, or do something else with that land, or just sell it to somebody else because now you've gotten the obstacle out of the way. So the process after June 3rd is not one that I'm familiar with at this point. It's certainly one that we will be investigating and seeing if there is an option. But at this point, our focus is make sure the board understands that there's huge opposition to this a decision to relocate the wetland, and that it can be challenged. It's certainly within the provincial laws, wetlands are protected. Those provincial laws, as somebody mentioned earlier, got rewritten. Sandy mentioned they got rewritten by the province retroactively, so that if they issue a ministerial zoning order, none of the rules apply. And in this case, there isn't a ministerial zoning order. One of the possibilities is that the Conservation Authority may say no, and the developers can go to Doug Ford, and Doug Ford will issue a ministerial zoning order, which will force the Conservation Authority to issue a permit, which is what happened with the Duffins Creek situation. We had a fair bit of description of that earlier in the webinar.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And I know that might seem, of course, it's frustrating. It might seem as though these letters are not enough, or you really want to do more and you wish you could get out there and do it. At Duffins Creek, there were, I can't recall the number, I feel like there were thousands of letters. I'm not going to remember the exact number. That made a huge difference. That was key to the success that they had there. So please try not to get it in your head that letters don't work. They absolutely do. It's a different kind of people power, but it's still very important. And I'm speaking over Peter. I see your hand up there, Peter. So if you'd like to go, you go right ahead.
Yeah, now this is a little bit different perspective. I don't know to what extent it might have been looked at, if at all, and that being from a Indigenous people point of view. Is this an area that had, being the headwaters there, and that, is that have any archaeological sites around there, or does it have any, does anybody know if there's any history in the area of native encampments back in history, and thus forcing it to slow down and have an archaeological dig minimum, or that it's got native rights? I mean, the land is it's significant from a native point of view, which could help force it not to happen. Not unlike they tried with the Red Hill Valley.
I can give a little,
yeah. Just someone mentioned in the chat that there were arrowheads found in this area. So it's potential, but sorry, Don, you're going to be able to speak to this much better, so you go right ahead.
Again, this is the normal process. If it was applied directly to the city, an archaeological assessment would be one of the requirements. That is, again, the developers in this case have jumped ahead on this process to try to get this specific feature out of their way, and get the Conservation Authority to make a premature decision. The other element in terms of looking at this from not just from an archaeological perspective, but from an Indigenous rights perspective. So the declaration that has been issued by the Confederacy chiefs for the Haldeman Tract is a legitimate, reasonable declaration that those lands fall under land claims that are recognized by the Canadian government and have not been resolved. And until they're resolved, there shouldn't be any changes that are approved without the agreement of the Indigenous people. If we'd been able to have Danielle on, and we're certainly going to try to get her for our next webinar, we can look at the issue of Indigenous rights with a broader brush. The agreements that were made between the settlers and the Indigenous people were not agreements of sale. They were agreements of sharing. They were agreements that these lands and their future of the lands and the ability of people to utilize these lands for hunting, for gathering, for collecting medicinal plants, for utilizing the waters and having the waters clean. Those are all part of the treaties that have not been respected. And it is significantly problematic that the Conservation Authority, in making a decision on this, is not reaching out to our Indigenous brothers and sisters and asking for their participation in this process and in this decision-making process that the Section 28 hearing will address. And this is the shift that's taking place across Turtle Island at this point, We're seeing lots of examples of this where the rights of Indigenous people are not only being overridden, but they're now being recognized as being overridden by larger and larger sections of the population. And more people are saying this is wrong. That's why we have a United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And that's why that has been or is in the process of being put through the federal government's federal parliament. It's been done at some level in BC. There's a shift taking place, and there's a legitimate basis to say here, this whole process is fundamentally flawed by its failure to recognize the shared relationship we have for the lands and waters with the Indigenous people who are the traditional caretakers of the lands and the waters.
Absolutely. That covered your question pretty well, Peter, but did you have anything you wanted to add at all?
That pretty much covers it. Because I didn't know if we could draw the people further in, and to whether at some point it may become another to be sensitive from
Not sure if it's only on. Go ahead. I'm not sure if it's only my. I can't hear you very well. Sorry, Peter. Go ahead.
Yeah, your internet connection is acting up as well. But with it, I'm just wondering to whether or not there might be a shutdown of the road. People that live in the area or have a business in the area, as opposed to construction crews getting in.
There is also a cultural heritage here for the settler colonialists. Owners, historic owners of this land is the Book family, and the Book family is recognized as the founding family of Ancaster. The folks that we met last night, part of the Book family, explained that to this is not just one of the farms of the Ancaster area that's being threatened, but this is has a particular significance to the cultural heritage.
If it matters since Ancaster has like been absorbed or whatever, but I think that's another valid point to bring up to the council. So we've covered many very great points tonight. I think we've got lots of material if you're interested in writing a letter to the Hamilton Conservation Authority about this, which again, we would absolutely encourage you to do. I'm not seeing any more hands up now, so unless I'm missing anyone, are we close to bringing this to an end? How do people feel?
Yeah.
I know some people joined us very late, so if I'm missing anyone, please let me know.
Oh, and thanks again for being here, for being part of this. We will send out a follow-up as we do after each of these webinars, and that's mainly the wonderful efforts of Stephanie. That will include a link to this recording, more detail in terms of what you might want to consider to put in a letter, who you send the letter to, the petition that was described by Alex when he was here, and other background material. One of the things that I would highly recommend is the David Suzuki Foundation has recently done several videos on on land defense, land defenders and the Indigenous land rights. And that included an hour-long interview with several people. I've watched it twice now. I would highly recommend it to anyone who wants to understand more thoroughly what the actual legal structures are, a legal situation is with respect to Indigenous rights, which have not generally been recognized by governments, even though the courts have ruled clearly on them. And they were really helpful for me. And so we'll try to put a link for that into the follow-up too. Thanks everybody for being here. Who's in charge here, Steph? You, me?
It is me. So
Okay.
yeah, thank